May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Well, the daffodils have gone, haven't they? They've come and they've been and they were wonderful and they were yellow everywhere, but they've gone. William Wordsworth was a poet who wrote about daffodils. You may know the poem. And it's a lovely poem. But he wrote another poem. He wrote a poem about the loss of his daughter. Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, I turned to share the transport. Oh, with whom but thee, long buried in the silent tomb. That spot which no vicissitude can find, love, faithful love, recalled thee to my mind, but how could I forget thee? Through what power, even for the least division of an hour, have I been so beguiled as to be blind to my most grievous loss? That thought's return was the worst pang that sorrow ever bore, save one only. When I stood forlorn, knowing my heart's best treasure was no more. That neither present time nor years unborn could to my sight that heavenly face restore. Perhaps a little bit of an insight into the pain of the widow who was about to bury her son. Jesus went to a place called Nain. It's not that far from Nazareth. It's up in the north. And there was a large crowd with him, and they were going one way into the town, and they meet coming the other way, a funeral. Any funeral is difficult. Any loss is hard, but this was an especially tragic loss. The dead boy was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And in those times, the loss of her only son meant no future for her, no social security, no safety net. She was now on her own with no way to look after herself. Jesus sees and understands this situation, and his heart goes out to her, and he says something which may have seemed a little strange when he first said it to her. He said, "Don't cry." But then he goes on to do what he does. Have you noticed that Jesus talks to the dead like they're alive? Lazarus is in his tomb, and he says, "Lazarus, come out." Jairus' daughter has died, and he speaks to her. And this young man, being carried out to his burial place, he goes and he touches the bier, the thing that they were carrying him on. The bearers stand still, wondering what's going to happen. This man has just touched the thing that they're carrying this young man on as they go to bury him. And he says, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And he sits up and begins to talk. Jesus speaks to the dead like they're alive, because when he speaks, things happen. When he speaks, life changes. When he speaks, things are not the same anymore. Romans in chapter 4 says that this is what God alone does, speaks to the dead as if they're alive. God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. We wonder sometimes, at least I do, about the reality of what's going on in our world and the reality of our news. And sometimes you read stuff and you think, well, it's just not right. It's just not true. And perhaps the people felt that just for a moment when he said, young man, get up. But then when he did get up, things had changed slightly. God speaks into our situations that seem one thing and they become another. There was a famous evangelist called D.L. Moody who was around the turn of the last century, the 19s into the 20s. And the story is told that he was asked to conduct a funeral service, so he decided to study the Gospels to find a funeral sermon that Jesus had preached. You know, learn from the best. However, as he searched, he discovered that there weren't any funeral sermons, because every funeral that Jesus meets, the person suddenly isn't dead anymore. God changes things. Jesus, his son, changes things. And the reaction of the people? They were filled with awe. They praised God. They said, a great prophet has come among us. God has come to help his people. God has come to help his people. That's what Jesus had come to do. Jesus had come to help his people, but not only those who thought they were his people, but those who thought they weren't. Jesus had come to make a difference in people's lives. Jesus had come to make the difference in the lives of individuals. At the beginning, he wasn't that well known. The authorities in Jerusalem didn't notice him for a while because he was up north, and up north, like it is in many countries, didn't really matter. I was up north. The capital was down south. But he was changing the lives of individuals one by one by one, and the people were in awe. God has come to help his people. That's what God does. He comes into our lives to help us. This widow had no thought of her son coming back to life. She didn't come and ask for help. She happened to meet him on the way, and he decided he was going to do something about it. And this is what Jesus was doing. And that one reaction was, God has come to help his people. Isn't this wonderful? But John the Baptist has a different reaction. John hears in prison about all the things that are being done, about what Jesus is doing and what's happening. And he sends some disciples to ask him what's going on, because the disciples come to John and they say, Jesus, this person you baptized, he's going around and he's doing this and he's doing that. And John's beginning to think, is he really the one? Because he wasn't doing what John had expected him to do. John expected him to do big, spectacular things that would change the political situation. John longed for the political situation to change. In fact, he'd got into trouble for that because he'd spoken out against Herod, and Herod had put him into prison and eventually would have him killed. But when he hears what Jesus is doing, it seems he gets a bit confused and perhaps is a little bit disappointed. It seems to me that John thought that if Jesus really were the Messiah, he would perform works that changed the political situation, changed the situation of the whole country. Perhaps changed his situation in prison. And now he's doubting. So he sends them to find out what's going on, because it's not what he expected. And so they come and they say to him, are you the one? Or should we look for someone else? Are you the one, the Messiah, the one that in their minds was going to change everything? There does seem to be an air of doubt and disappointment about it. Do you ever feel like that with God? That he doesn't do things quite the way we want them done. He doesn't do things sometimes the way we ask him or the way that we expect. And perhaps that can lead to doubt, or it can lead to disappointment. Even John the Baptist, his cousin, the one who'd been baptizing in the desert, the one who pointed him to him and said, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And some of his disciples went and followed Jesus. Even he can doubt. But the problem with doubting is that sometimes when we do doubt and when we're worried, and John was genuinely worried about this, sometimes we don't investigate. We don't ask God to show us what's right and what's good. We don't ask God, Lord, I don't understand. Perhaps we feel that we can't say to God, I don't understand. Or perhaps we think he's going to get upset. The thing is, as we sang, we come to him as we are. He sees us as we are. If we doubt and if we're worried and we're not sure what he's doing and why he's doing it, he sees it and he just waits for us. He waits for us to talk to him about it. I'm going to take my life in my hands now. There have been times when I've asked someone of the female persuasion, what's wrong? And they've said to me, nothing. Now, it took me a while to realize that just sometimes when that happens, I shouldn't do the man thing and think, oh, well, there's nothing wrong, fine, go on with my life. I actually should say, are you sure? And if I was being Irish, are you sure you're sure? Sometimes I get an answer that's different right away. And just sometimes it takes a little while. And I have to say, that's also true of me with God sometimes. Sometimes I don't want to admit to him how I'm really feeling, what I'm really thinking. But God already knows. And he longs for us to speak to him about it. And so Jesus doesn't take an insult. Jesus doesn't take this wrong. But he replies to the messengers, go back and report to John what you've seen and heard. Just go back and tell him what you've seen. You've seen it. You've seen what I'm doing. You've heard what I'm saying. Go back and tell him. I actually find this quite intriguing in the sense that he says, report what you have seen and what you have heard. Jesus doesn't put on a special show for these disciples. He doesn't say, come with me and I'll show you that I am the Messiah. He doesn't say, come with me and I'll show you what it's all about. He says, but you've seen it and you've heard it. Just go back and tell him that. Well, he does elaborate a little. He talks about the blind receiving sight, the lame walking, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. But he says, just tell him what you've seen. Because this is what the Messiah's work is about. And so often over the decades I've been a minister, I've heard people say, oh, this country isn't once what it was. If only this, or if only that, if only the government would pay attention to what God has to say. Well, the government in Jesus' days weren't paying very much attention to what God was saying. But Jesus wasn't complaining about them. Jesus was just getting on with what God had called him to do. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy, the outcasts, the ones you shouldn't touch, the ones you should almost quite literally run away from if you saw them coming, are healed, are changed. The deaf hear, and the dead are raised. He says, what more? It's like he's saying, what more is John looking for? Well, John is looking for a political solution. John is looking for the Romans to be chucked out. And the good news is proclaimed to the poor. I found it interesting, the President of the United States' reaction to the election of the new Pope. His first reaction was, yay, he's an American. Isn't that wonderful to have an American who's the new Pope? And then kind of realized what kind of man he was and what kind of things he said. And perhaps he's not quite so popular with the president now. Because actually, one of the things that he's talked about before he was Pope is the poor. About the need for the poor to hear the good news. about the poor needing their lives to be changed, about the poor needing to have their voice heard. Because the truth is, in our society, as in all societies, as it has been down through the centuries and the millennia, those who have wealth and those who have power have their voices heard. They don't need help to have their voices heard. They're heard. But the poor need people who have power to stand up for them and to speak out for them. And that's what Jesus says is happening. It wouldn't be popular when the leaders did hear about it. It wouldn't be popular that the poor were hearing that God was on their side, that God was for them, that God wanted to bless them. And I have heard reports, I've read stuff from America where pastors are talking about how their congregations are telling them off for preaching about the good news for the poor, being called woke. And when they talk about the fact that it's Jesus who's saying these things, not them, there have been some that have been told, well, that was fine for those days, but that's out of date. We need to move on from that. Well, no, we don't. We need to move back to that. In answer to John's question of why aren't you doing things the way I expect, he says, I'm doing what I want to do and what is right. Morgan, one of the commentators, says, to all such restless impatience, in other words, why aren't you sorting everything out? He utters the same warning. Then goes on to say, for the most part, the way of the Lord's service is a way of plodding perseverance in the doing of apparently small things. The history of the church shows that this is one of the lessons most difficult to learn. Oh, we look for big things. We look for spectacular things. We look for things that will change the nation. And then I have to ask myself, am I willing for him to change me? And to use me to change the lives of the people I meet day by day. He says, blessed is anyone who doesn't stumble because of me. Blessed is anyone, he's saying, who doesn't get upset because I'm not doing things the way that they want me to and the way that they expect me to. Jesus knew that the focus of his ministry was going to get him into trouble. He knew it. He knew it because the Jewish people expect a political solution. They expect to have freedom once more from the Romans and from the Roman domination. They expected to instead have the freedom of being ruled over by their own important people instead of people who spoke Latin. But he says there's a blessing for those who were not offended because the Messiah doesn't come to do what we expect him to do. And God's the same today as he always was. He doesn't do what we expect him to do. Yes, it's true. He has come and he is at work. He's at work among us. He's at work among the people in our community. He's at work in our nation. But he's at work in people one by one by one. He's at work in people's lives as we come across them and as they come across us. As they see our smile and they hear our words, as they see our concern for them, as they see our willingness to talk about his love and his involvement in our lives. When I wasn't a minister, they wouldn't say it to me now, but people I got to know would say things like, you go to church, don't you? And I tried most of the time to say, yeah, but that's not what it's about. It's not about going to church. It's about knowing the one who's given me salvation. The one who longs to know me and for me to know him. God is at work in my life and I'm imperfect. And I would say sometimes to the women in the office, I was in an office with myself and 4 women. They kept me in order very well when I worked in the school. But it's about God at work in me. I'm imperfect. I'm not finished yet. But God is involved in my life. It's about more than just going to church. If you're in doubt, talk to God about it. If you're in doubt about the way God's doing things and why he's doing things, talk to him about it. Ask him to show you his way. And he says, blessed is anyone who doesn't stumble. Blessed is anyone who doesn't get upset. when they see God at work. We should be praying, whether it's at Chris's meeting, and I encourage you to go to that, or not. We should be praying that God would do his work here in this place and touch people's lives. But beware, because he won't do it the way you want him to. Because the way I want and the way you want won't necessarily work, won't necessarily bless people. But he does things the way he wants. And he will bring among us people who are awkward, people who are difficult, people who don't understand, people who take up a lot of our time, people who get things wrong. But he'll love them all the same, and he calls us to love them all the same as well. And he will change this church. I don't mean the building. The building's lovely. I don't think it needs a lot of changes. But he will change us as he adds people to us. He will change us and move us. I mean, wouldn't it be good if we got to the day where we had to say, we must make sure the balcony's all fixed and all safe because we're going to use it every week? Wouldn't it be good when we got to the day when that got full and we had to say, well, we're going to have to start meeting in homes, or we're going to have to plant another church somewhere? And wouldn't it be good, not just because I could say, oh, I'm in charge, as if I was in charge. I'm in charge of a church that's really growing and being blessed and going well. That's completely irrelevant. What matters is that people begin to say in that community out there, God is at work among us. And you know who's going to cause that? It's God. Not a strange minister from Northern Ireland. It's God. And it's through you and me. Not through the big spectacular things that you think you'll never be able to do and wouldn't be able to cope with, but the ordinary, everyday things of dealing with and being involved with people that no one else wants to know or to be part of. And maybe, just maybe, sometimes that's the way you feel about yourself. Don't feel important. Don't feel you matter. Don't feel that people take any notice. Well, God does. God hears you when you talk to him. God hears you when you cry out to him. God longs for you to know him and to know his love and to know that closeness. Because he's got stuff for you to do. The ordinary, everyday that transforms the lives of others.